Well, hello, welcome to the first of our panels on day two. I'm Mark Chataway. I'm one of the advisory council of BQMD, the moderator of this session. Lovely to have you with us. For those of you who believe in conspiracy theories, I'm going to give you ammunition for conspiracy theories. So today is the one day in the last year that my super fast microwave connection has gone out. EJ, who is the substitute moderator for this session, is also having internet problems. And Simba Makoni is also having internet problems, who's one of our participants. So the lesson I think you take from this is that whoever is getting to us, Michael and Laura haven't annoyed them yet, but they might as the panel goes on. So if we all disappear, you'll know the conspiracy is at work. No, it's lovely to have you with us, and let me introduce the panelists who we hope to have with us throughout this 40-minute session. Michael Anderson is joining us from the UK. He's the CEO of medaccess.org, something we're not going to do justice to in this panel, but go and have a look at medaccess.org to see all of the interesting and innovative things they're doing around innovative finance for access to medicines. He's a visiting fellow at the Center for Global Development and the former CEO of the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, and he was the UK Prime Minister's Special Envoy for the UN Development Goals. Laura Frigenti is joining us. She's the Global Head of International Development Assistance Services Institute at KPMG. She's on the board of eminent advisors to the president of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and she's the former director of strategy and operations at the World Bank. And then we hope joining us, although it's a blank screen at the moment, yes, a blank screen still, sadly, is Simba Makoni, who's one of my colleagues in BED CMC, the consulting organization I work for, and managing director of a development consulting company in Zimbabwe. He's the former Minister of Finance and Development of Zimbabwe, and the former executive secretary of the Southern African Development Community. And by the way, has a PhD in biochemistry. And I always use Simba as my example of ministers who love listening to scientists and can then explain to you the difficulties politicians have in following the advice that scientists give them. So let's hope Simba is able to join us. Michael, Laura, if I may, Dr. Pat, I know you were both sitting listening as I was to what Dr. Pate said. And I was really struck by his description of tribalism as the antithesis of network governance. And I thought, yes, that is so true, that it's our universal job to fight that kind of tribalism. But were there, in 30 seconds, were there things that particularly struck you about what he said? Laura, let me start with you.
Well, I think that, the key message that we should all reflect upon is that no matter how well an individual country or an individual, group is doing, you cannot just create your little bubble and protect yourself. We are in this all together. So, which applies, of course, to many other global public goods type of agendas like climate change, etc. But either we find a solution that works for the world or we are all going to sink together. I think Mohammed said that firmly and gently at the same time, but I think that this is what many politicians and public officials should really continue reflecting upon.
And he said, the way he framed it, I thought was wonderful. He said inequality is bad for everyone. And then, as I recall it, he gave the list. He said it's bad for high-income countries, it's bad for the private sector, it's bad for the world. And he added almost as an afterthought, and it's bad for low and lower middle-income countries. And that really is the way we should look at it, that inequality is not just bad for people living in poorer countries, it's even worse for us. Yeah, it was very powerful, that, Laura, I agree.
Well, I think if I may comment on this, that, we were thinking about that in the 70s, for example, when there were the big issues was inequality within individual society, that in a way, the best way of guaranteeing stability to society was to make sure that there was more equality and less inequality. I think that now that probably individual countries have sort of solved those issues internally, at least in terms of access to, to basic needs. This issue works globally, and it's really with the same identical line of reasonings that was used in those decades needs now to be translated to what is going to happen to the world as it emerges from the pandemic and in this post-globalization type of phase.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
So
Michael.
I was going to chip in. I think, Mohammed was talking about the Act A initiative and bringing as a network of governance and bringing together lots of different organizations. Being somewhat involved in that discussion, that it was difficult because of all the turf issues the organizations have, but it's great the world achieved as much as it did. And that's something to build on. And I think in particular, the centrality of the World Health Organization and recognizing its expertise and coordinating role, which I know that the current Director General is trying to build out, is really important. That said, I think that we are in a place in the world where we should not be congratulating ourselves too much. I think Act A has been terrific. But at the global stage at the moment, in terms of inequality, we are seeing, frankly, stunning levels of inequality, which have been exacerbated by COVID. And it is exactly what you said, Mark, about the systemic effects of that, the sort of research of Michael Marmot or Richard Wilkinson in terms of the systemic effects of inequality across the whole system. Everyone's worse off by inequality. And we now have a situation, despite the best efforts of Act A and COVAX and so on, that we do have just frankly shocking global inequality in access to vaccines at the moment. And the world that I live in finance, there has been a growing inequality in terms of capital flight away from emerging markets towards safety markets. So while there's been health inequality, we've had this real exacerbation of capital inequality and access to capital inequality. And so the world, in terms of inequality, it's got a lot tougher in the last year. And that's something we're going to have to deal with in the coming generation.
Yeah, the data on private investment flows into Africa is really shocking. I hadn't noticed it before, but it's really shocking. And yeah.
Yeah, well, and this is something that Laura and others who are experts in international finance will know more than me. But we're clearly looking at increasing fragility in terms of debt ratios. And all it would take is an uptick in inflation, an increase in interest rates around the world for that kind of, almost inevitable road traffic accident to happen in terms of greater debt calls, and with greater interest rate burdens on national budgets, that makes less available for spending on important things like health and infrastructure. So we can easily get in a downward spiral, and so there's a lot of fragility in the system. Not least because COVID has caused a lot of costs, which will have to be, it's dug a lot of holes where we have to go back and fill in later.
So, Laura, I do want to come to you on that. Simba Makoni has just posted in the chat that he's having internet problems, so he'll join us when he can. If you'd like to post it, if any of those watching, participating around the world would like to post in the chat, we're very keen to have you in the discussion. So please do post comments or questions there, and we'll take them. So, Laura, that is a point, isn't it? That this fragility, the assumption that we're headed for a time of higher inflation, all of the costs that are both COVID related and COVID linked. What impact is that going to have on the ability of countries to meet the Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, let me start with saying that the world wasn't in a good place even pre-COVID, in a sense that the last time that the global leader, joined together in the context of the United Nations General Assembly, which is that moment where you take stock of the progress made on international development. The good news was that not one single country was on track to achieve all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So that is where we were at the time in which, of course, an unprecedented shock hit the world, causing two main things. First of all, the need for unforeseen, very high investments on both health and economic incentives to the population. Second, paralysis, or at least a slowdown in global trade, in production, in supply chain, et cetera, that has really caused 2020 has been a very low intensity year for trade, for investment, for flows of funds, etc., etc. So the combination of these two things is, of course, dramatic. And I'm not saying that the big investments that were made by the authorities, both to keep, people afloat and to invest, in the health-related needs of the pandemic were unjustified. But clearly they derailed even more so the prospects of achieving the SDG. And I also felt that there was an additional psychological negative impact, which is that each and every country became more inward looking than they had been pre-COVID. And so the idea, which is obviously justified, but you would expect that politicians see beyond the immediate need, that you have to take care of your own, and then only after you have done that you can start thinking about others, which is what de facto happened, obviously made it even more difficult for people to start thinking about the big challenges, the big global public goods, the way in which, you and Michael and I were talking in the initial minutes of this conversation, when we were saying, well, you cannot really create your own bubble. I'm thinking about yesterday, we saw the economic forecast. The United Kingdom is going to bounce back with a fantastic 6.4 growth rate, which is the highest since 1941. The European Union at large is going to have a 4+ something growth. The United States is doing very well. Ultimately, we need to trade with somebody else. We need to have economic activities that go beyond the bubble of your own country. So even these fantastic good results, they need to be grounded in an economy that by now is global and globalized and will be much more so. And so, we really need to start thinking about how we can internalize again the concept that we are in this all together, and that therefore that investing becomes very important.
So I'm going to try and see if I can bring Simba in by voice only, because I know his video isn't holding up, but we might have his voice. Simba, if you, and Laura, I'm going to come to you on this as well, but if you think about how finance ministries, how planning ministries have responded to past economic shocks, which look as if they're less profound than this shock, what can we say about how finance and planning ministries in developing countries are likely to respond to this shock, Simba? Simba, are you there? I think maybe not. Simba, are you there? No. We'll have to bring him in later. Laura, Simba, there. Are you there? No. Laura, what do you think? How do you think finance and planning ministries in emerging economies will respond?
You can't see me.
Maybe he's there. I don't know. Well, let me just say, first of all, that we have never seen a crisis that was so globalized, in a way that, there was a moment in which we really felt that the whole world was, standing still. In reality, is that during precedent crisis, there has always been a kind of a part of the global economy that was triggering everybody else, that was, keeping growing. Sometimes China, sometimes other part of the world, etc., etc. So obviously the attitude that was taken by the authorities was very conservative, in terms of, as I was saying before, thinking about what do I need to do in terms of meeting the health needs of this crisis, and in keeping the households afloat. And the one thing that we have seen, and I hope that the moment that the crisis is over, that will stimulate a good discussion in government about what that they need to have themselves prepared, because we have seen that countries that have a national health system in place did better than countries that didn't have it. that countries that had a good system of safety net in place to protect the workers did better than countries that didn't have it, even if, now the people that are observers with enthusiasm of the US economic capacity to bounce back will tell you that the US is bouncing back faster, but there was a time in which, and I can say living here, that we had millions and millions and millions of people, unemployed by the week. And we thought that there was no tomorrow on this situation. So I think that, the attitude was protective. I think that many did the right things, which was to try to find as much as possible public funding at subsidized, rate to absorb part of the cost. But clearly, all the national investment plans on other things, more development oriented, et cetera, were completely frozen.
And Michael, I mean, they were frozen. And at the same time, we appear to be seeing a decline in overall flows of overseas development assistance. Dr. Patia was talking about how the World Bank has front-loaded all of this spending, but presumably if they front-loaded the spending, that suggests there may be less to spend in the future.
Well, look, I think there are going to be systemic economic shocks, partly from Laura identified about what was in place before the pandemic hit. I think it's important to remember that on health spending in ODA eligible countries, ODA accounts for only 1.5% of health spending. So the huge bulk of health spending is national. And so the decline in tax revenues that comes along with declining GDP is going to be the single biggest hit by a long way. And then on ODA levels, we have seen a spike
Sorry, Michael, we should just say for people watching who might not know,
oh, yes.
ODA, an acronym for Overseas Development Assistance, meaning the transfers of money from rich countries to emerging economies. Sorry.
What is traditionally referred to as kind of official aid. Yeah. Thank you. So we have seen a spike, but I think that we are likely to see a real decline and in ODA levels in the future, partly because a lot of the high income countries are contracting in their economies. Some of them may bounce back, but also there is another dynamic going on, which is that a lot of countries, as they have grown over the years, have graduated from being low income to middle income. And so not eligible for as much of the concessional finance that they used to get. I mean, if you take Gavi, for instance, Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines, in 2015, they supported 73 countries. By 2021, they're down to 57 because of the graduation, which means the countries are kind of on their own. And I wanted to go back to the point you made and Laura made about interdependence. We are ironically at this moment in COVID, we are more interdependent than we've ever been before. And yet, ironically, we have seen a huge escalation in terms of nationalistic thinking. Politicians are much more aware about health, but they're putting it in a national security context and national priorities, which makes sense. And just at the time when we need global supply chains to be working well, there's a real emphasis on shortening supply chains and trying to move away from international dependence. So we are, I think, at a critical moment. But we're going to come on to this, where the money going to come from. But I think that the idea that it comes either from lots of domestic funding that's readily available or lots of aid coming in, neither of those are going to be fantastic solutions for the next few years.
I'm going to try Simba one more time to see if he wants to explain to us the sort of pressures politicians are under at times like these. Simba, is your audio back? No, I think it's not. Okay. By the way, don't let I know there's a big discussion in the chat between the producers and me. Don't let that put you off. If those of you watching have questions or comments or input, use the chat, put it in, and we'll address those. Michael, Laura, from ODA to IDA, I'll let you define IDA, Michael, because you'll do a much better job than me, or Laura, indeed. From ODA to IDA, we've seen this shift in financing from the World Bank Group. At least in recent times, we've seen a shift to more of it being used for health, right? So let me start with Michael and then come to Laura on that, if I may, and ask if we think that's sustainable and important, and explain what we mean by IDA financing, if you would.
Yes. So IDA is the International Development Association concessional finance part of the World Bank. It is the most important concessional finance. There's long-term loans with relatively low interest rates and relatively easily forgiven. Really important finance, especially for those countries which don't have access to other capital flows. Absolutely critical. So we have seen IDA, in 2016, health was 7.36% of IDA, and it jumped up to 14% of IDA in 2020. So we've seen, in just a few years, the amount of IDA that's going to health has doubled. That's good news. It means that does mean, by the way, that some of the IDA funds provided by the World Bank are coming out of things like road building and agriculture and so on, which have real costs. But there's more going into health, which is important. But because of the issues that Mohammed talked about bringing forward increased spending from IDA to address COVID, the cupboard is now bare. It's not quite bare, but the World Bank recently took a decision to bring forward the replenishment of IDA, because IDA is a big pot of money the World Bank has, but every few years it has to call together all the rich countries and say, please put more money into this pot. And the World Bank just announced, I think it was last week, they're bringing forward the new IDA 20 replenishment. So that's going to be, if we're going to have that money, which is really important for health systems in a lot of countries and important for providing the overall infrastructure within which PQMD can operate effectively, and everyone has interest in PQMD can operate effectively. The World Bank is now going to be going to donors and say, we need more money. We need you to empty your pockets and bring more money into IDA 20. And we need you to bring it earlier. And we'd like more, by the way. And we need more money for funding climate change as well as health and a range of other things they've identified as thematic areas of spending. So I think, the World Bank in particular has done a good job of bringing forward a bunch of spending to help respond to COVID. But it does mean that we're now going to be needing to generate some more finance. The good news is ever since the financial crisis and quantitative easing and, low interest rates, we've seen global capital markets flooded with easy money, with fairly low interest rates. So that's good news. There's a lot of debt around to be used. The bad news is a lot of countries are now feeling constrained. I mean, my own country, the UK, is just one example. It's perhaps the worst of countries saying, well, we're going to have to look after ourselves first. And GDP has dropped, so we're going to have less money for aid. And we've just paid a bunch of money to Gavi and to COVAX and others for responding to global crises. So I think for a whole range of health issues outside of COVID, we may be looking at a time when some of the funding flows are going to be squeezed for a while, at least for official assistance.
So Laura, I mean, do you share that analysis? And can I ask you to talk a little bit about the impact of all of that debt that's been building up that Michael was talking about, and you hinted at a bit earlier what some of the consequences might be?
I just wanted maybe to make a couple of considerations just to explain historically, the trends of resources. First of all, it's true. I mean, traditionally, historically, World Bank funding to health and education has been much lower than other sectors because those were the sectors that were very much the preferred sectors from large bilateral donors, the DFIDs, the USAIDs, etc., etc. And therefore, the governments had made this kind of mental allocation that they would use grant money for things that were not perceived as having economic returns, like education and health, and use, World Bank resources for roads, infrastructures, energy, etc., etc. As the bilateral donors decline their support, as the support of bilateral donors to the social sectors in general decline, then the World Bank came in. And of course, 2020 has been phenomenal if you look at the aggregate number, but the reality is that the bulk of those resources have not been going to what I would have liked to see them going, which is strengthening the health sector and the stable delivery system of countries, but have gone to, to cope with this emergency situation. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we are going to have to deal with a kind of a snowball effect because the normal patient cares that, you know, everybody would have done under normal circumstances, of having your blood tested and look at your cholesterol level, of going and do your cancer screening, or going and do your mammogram, et cetera, has been postponed by many for obvious and justifiable reasons. But that is going to be an impact on global public health, and is going to create really the need for an acceleration in creating stable health system that provide you know, access to good quality and efficiently managed health service to everybody. And I want to stress the point of efficiently managed, because when we do talk about, you know, health is by definition one of the worst managed sector, together with education, in each and every government across the board, from the OECD countries all the way down, is an inefficient sector. For several reasons, including the fact that it's very labor intensive, that there are multi-dimensional, et cetera, et cetera. So when we talk about how to finance the sector, we always talk about additionality, which is important, and this is needed. But I also think that, you know, a lot needs to be rethought in terms of managing, particularly the higher level of the sector, the hospital management, et cetera, the high level facilities. Can these be managed in a different way, in a way that is more efficient? Can we really use, for example, the experiences that we have learned during COVID, of how we can do distant service provision for certain things? Do you really have to go every time, you know, in the facility and talk to the doctors and so on and so forth? I mean, I think that there is a lot of good lessons that may emerge from this 1 year experience that we had in the pandemic, that should be really internalized and reapplied in looking at how we can use the resources that we have more efficiently, more effectively. And then, of course, I mean, the important conversation, I was also very happy, you know, along with what Michael said, to see the World Bank accelerating the process of replenishment IDA, because that's very important. And I hope that is a successful, I like to believe that it's going to be a very successful replenishment under the circumstances. So we do need the additionality, but we also cannot just always be additionality.
And exactly, no, and I want to come on to this. I mean, I want to use our last 10 minutes to talk about how to fund that kind of innovation in healthcare systems, because even if it's generating longer term efficiency, it requires short-term spending to set it up. Your point about inefficiency, though, is striking. I moderated a panel last year, and a senior German official asked me before the panel, I'll ask you this question: how many times do you think the average German sees a doctor in a year? Would anybody like to guess? 2. What do you think, Laura?
A doctor, like his general doctor, or also consultants?
Consultants, and any kind of medicine.
Minimum 15.
Yeah, 15? Yeah, you're much closer. 24. So twice a month. Twice a month, the average German sees a doctor. And I said to him, "Are you sure?" And I won't put the finger on him. But he said, "I'm in charge of collecting the data." Yes, I'm very sure. So there's this drive for efficiency, and there's, I suppose, the potential for middle-income countries and lower-income countries that don't have those powerful vested interests to leapfrog over us in the use of these new technologies and in the adoption of technology. So I want to talk in just a second about how that will be paid for. But there's a question from one of our audience members. Have middle-income countries been set back or driven back into lower income groups as a result of the global economic contraction due to COVID? And Michael, you said earlier, these countries are sort of graduating. So some of these countries fall where they're...
Well, I didn't catch all of your question, Mark, but I think it's about the question about countries graduating from low income to middle income. So countries graduate out of IDA, they graduate out of Gavi. If you take, and both have smoothing mechanisms. So, you know, take Gavi, for example, they take a 3-year average in terms of income to make sure that countries don't get dumped off the cliff too quickly. And they've also, both IDA and Gavi have developed systems for thinking about how to smooth out the transition. I think we may see some countries fall back, but if it's some middle income countries may fall back. But I think that in general, the good news is the trend will continue to be upward. 35 million people have been pulled back into poverty by COVID this year. So that's not good. That's just in Africa. That's not good. And there are going to be effects for some years. But in general, I think the secular trend, the increase into higher income categories, is going to continue. So I think that's important. We do need to think about new ways of financing in this context, and I hope we can come on to that.
Great. Okay, Simba, I see you have your hand raised. Is your audio back on with us?
Let's sit, Mark.
Oh, we can hear you.
Mark, me?
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
You can.
Yes.
I have a very distinct picture and following conversation, but I wanted to make a brief comment. Literally, conversation about the state of the lockdown. One was in the Treasury, and was at the Ministry of Health. Both concurred that there will be budget surplus in quote because spending was reduced in the lockdown. And I asked, are surpluses going to be deployed for COVID whenever that is? Both of them, sure.
So Simba, the quality. Sorry, the quality wasn't great. But if I heard you correctly, the contacts you had within ministries suggested to you that surpluses have built up during the time of COVID for some of the reasons Laura was outlining, that people haven't used routine healthcare services, and your question was, would they be deployed? Is that right?
Yeah, and they were non-committal about that. From Treasury, and I asked him why not, because those should be. They said we don't know that they will then.
Yes. So there's this danger that this money which is unspent, Laura, this money which hasn't been spent on routine healthcare, disappears. I hadn't thought about that. Thank you, Simba. And I mean, I suppose that's part of the puzzle of what we do to recover, because there are short-term savings that they haven't run diagnostic tests, they haven't provided routine care, which are going to lead to vast long-term costs, metastatic cancer, childhood diseases that could have been prevented. Simba, if you're still with us, do you think there's a chance that countries will increase their spending on national health systems?
Theory, they should assume this surplus or that we just talked about. That would be the rational and important high priority in the nature of our politics, particularly in the South. I'm not sure that I could bet my bottom dollar that will happen.
Right. So Simba's not betting his bottom dollar on it. In the few minutes we have left, Laura, would you bet on countries increasing?
No, I would bet with Simba, actually, in a sense that I think that we need to remember also, because we are here, of course, focusing on health, but this has been a big crisis from many other aspects. So government has spent an enormous amount of resources in supporting business, staying open and alive, and supporting households, who have either lost their jobs, etc. And at the same time, as I think you, Mark, were saying, or Michael, the level of fiscal revenues has declined because there has been less trade, less production, etc. So the nationally raised resources in 2021 are very likely going to be much lower than the pre-COVID level. So the base for spending is lower. There has been an acceleration in fast disbursing spending, which is also something that is a different animal than traditional spending, for example, in longer term projects like infrastructures, etc., that are paced over time. Here, all the money has gone billions in a week, out to people, to business, etc. So I don't see, unfortunately, for the next couple of years, until really we go back to pre-COVID level of stability, any kind of increase in health spending. This is why public resources become so important. And this is why also I think looking at what you can control, which is the efficiency in the use of your own resources to do more with the same, I think become a very important aspect of this equation.
Here for doing more of the same, maybe doing new parts. Is there a potential for government and private sector and the kind of civil society groups in PQMD to find new ways of working together that will help bridge this gap? Feel free to say no, but I'm hoping.
Mark, it wasn't clear to whom that was addressed. Was that for me or Laura?
I'm sorry, to you, Michael. It was to you.
Okay,
it was to you.
Great. Well, look, I suppose my personal view is that public expenditure is going to be really important and continue to be important. And as Laura said, one of the lessons of this is national health systems are a backbone, and countries with national health systems do much better. And that's going to be true of a whole bunch of things. That said, I think it is time for us to think COVID has accelerated us into a world, into a new normal, where we need to think more creatively, and we have good examples of how to mobilize private finance effectively for public health outcomes. Not simply, so much private finance has been about funding the individual health outcomes of single individuals, but we need to think more. So I'm going to just give two examples because I realize we're almost out of time. One of them is the company that I run, MedAccess. We're a finance company, but we're a not-for-profit finance company. And our model is that we partner with companies who have products, typically products that are high margin, important, effective health products they would like to bring into new markets, but new markets are risky because of uncertainty of demand, uncertainty of regulatory conditions, and so on. So we provide guarantees that help companies to move into those markets with the objective of reducing, to make products affordable and to make them accessible. And that kind of finance can be very creative. And we see a string of examples now where we help bring products into markets faster to people who need them most. That's one example. Second example is we're working on a partnership now, which we still can't reveal the details, but a proposal for a number of private companies working with the government, where the private companies would make purchases of COVID vaccines for their own employees, but the scheme is a buy one, give one. For each vaccine they purchase for their own employees, they would give a vaccine dose to the government for distribution to public health. And that's because companies recognize, and this isn't just charity, it's because they recognize the absolutely critical importance to their own thriving as companies that they need to help control the pandemic. So those are both models. There's a very quick third one, which is COVID has brought us a new reality. We're in conditions of scarcity. Even those with money are not able to get access to the products they want. And that has been a new market failure that we've not seen before. And I think we can use pooled procurement to help get around that problem. I'll stop at that.
There's a really interesting thought. So a teaser for more. In the 30 seconds we don't have left, but I'm going to take 30 seconds. Simba, if you're there, can you give us 30 seconds on which kind of voices can push politicians to spend those scarce resources in a time of scarcity on health?
Mark, it depends on the political in the different regions. I think the civil society is important. can be heard. In other jurisdictions, a voice, but the official political. It depends on country. There is room for voices to be raised. If there's still, like Michael was saying, and the discussion about public partners, with spirited effort by the private sector to bring measures to mitigate the COVID pandemic, accentuated the inequalities.
Yeah, so Simba, it was breaking up a bit there. Sorry, I think clearly that for the organizations around the table at PQMD, there's a need to do an analysis and see in which country which voices can be heard to push politicians in that direction of spending more on health. And it may be civil society, it may be traditional political groupings, political parties, it may be the private sector. So thank you. Simba, I'm sorry we've had such technical problems. I apologize for technical problems on my side too, but it's still been a fascinating discussion. Laura, Michael, Simba, thank you again.